Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The End of Surrender by B.T. Narro, narrated by Simon Vance. Chapter 1. Darren sat between the human and Analite kings, watching his sons. It was a joy to see both Leo and Andar smiling, but especially Leo, after he had buried his mentor, Karen Trange, beside so many ally soldiers. King Dasvis Mepler, the ruler of the Analytes, did not want to host a feast. He said it was not right after a funeral, but that was just another cultural difference between Analytes and humans, as Darren had pointed out. He had also reminded Dasvis that a failure to understand each other's cultures had led to many deaths, and could lead to many more. However, the greed of Jarl Marx and Prince Gaval had been underestimated by everyone, not just Analytes. Darren felt partially responsible for his failure to predict that they would fight for the treasure of the Analyte king, but he would use that guilt to make sure he did not make such a mistake ever again. The remaining soldiers needed to celebrate. Although many among them had died, they had won the battle against Jarl Marx and Prince Gaval. King Mavrim Orello, the leader of the humans, had helped convince Dasvis not only to provide a feast, but to hold it in the banquet hall of the palace. The leaders needed to do everything in their power to keep morale high. The great battle against the Rift Beast would take place tomorrow. Many would fall, as they had in the last battle. There would be another funeral, but the Rift would be destroyed. There were many injured as well after the last battle, Darren included. It would be a long time before his leg was fully healed, but at least he could walk, now that it had been a few weeks. He had never been off his feet for so long before. It had been maddening, though there were plenty of worries to occupy his mind. One of the most surprising concerns had been the amount of time he noticed Andar spending with the Analyte princess Siki Mepler. Darren had tried to lecture his eldest son that it was not healthy to develop feelings for her, but Andar had told him that it was too late. Now Andar just wanted to make the most of the time they had together. Darren didn't approve, but Andar was too old for Darren to demand that he stop. Darren tried to forget his worries as he watched his boys at the long table nearby. The celebration was far too loud for him to make out any conversation, but he could see that Andar seemed to be doing most of the talking. Siki had left her seat beside her brother at the royal table to sit at Andar's side. She and Andar were quite flirtatious toward each other in plain sight, Darren had noticed with growing concern. Through their quips and laughs, there was a look shared between them that Darren was certain Siki's father had noticed as well. This was the reason for his concern. Darren's younger son Leo sat on Andar's other side, with Raigan Nexi next to him. From the smiles upon their lips, they seemed to be enjoying the feast as well as everyone else. Darren still thought that Leo, at 14, was too young to invest so much of his heart into a young lady, but this couldn't be helped, for no amount of lecturing could change how he and Raigan felt about each other. Darren figured it was common to be concerned, and sometimes powerless, as the father of teenage children, but that didn't make it any easier. Leo looked over and smiled at Darren, then gave a nod. Darren smiled back. Darren's gaze shifted to Siki, as she put her hand on Andar's arm while laughing at one of his quips. Oh, no. Darren turned to find the king glaring at him, Dasvis's expression tight with growing anger. "Shouldn't you tell your boy that he needs to focus on tomorrow?" Dasvis complained. "Much depends on his success." That was true. Andar had the greatest responsibility out of all the 6,000 troops that were left, but there was something else that was true about Andar that Dasvis needed to know. Since Andar was a boy, he's always been able to focus when it's time to do so. He knows how much is at stake. He is merely trying to enjoy this night. "He's enjoying it a little too much," said the king. That might be true, Darren thought, as he watched his son put his flat palm against Siki's, as if to compare something about their hands. "I told you," Andar exclaimed, "and you didn't believe me." Darren didn't hear Siki's reply as she laughed, but he would have to be blind not to notice the two of them interlocking their fingers as they let their hands rest on the table. Dasvis grumbled something in Analyse as he gestured for a servant. One hurried over. Dasvis said just a few words before the servant was rushing towards Siki. She turned and noticed the woman coming and quickly put her hand on her lap. A nervous look spread across her face as the servant spoke to her. Darren imagined the pale skin of her cheeks would blush red, if they hadn't already been that colour. A moment later, Siki was following the servant back to her chair beside her brother at the royal table. Dasvis leaned forward to catch her gaze, but she wouldn't look at him. Her brother said something that eventually convinced her to turn to Dasvis, reluctantly. Her father spoke sternly. Darren didn't need to understand the language to know that it was a lecture, a rightful one at that. She was engaged to be married to a man who was the heir of his father's great wealth. Darren didn't know much about his family, except that they had agreed to help Dasvis pay for the rebuilding of the Analite cities that were lost because of the massive growing rift. Siki would be wed soon after it was finally destroyed. Darren normally wouldn't care who Andar flirted with, but sharing a connection with the Analite princess would just lead to heartache. Besides, it added tension on top of an already tense situation between the two kings, Dasvis and Mavrim. Many humans and Analites had died recently on this land, but it was the Analites who suffered the worst blow to their strength. There were 8,000 of them not too long ago, but after the dust settled there were now only 3,000 left. Dasvis paid his soldiers well, and they had reason to fight, so Darren knew that recruitment was not the issue. They simply lacked the numbers they needed to grow their army. This rift had taken so many Analite lives, but many had also been taken by Jarl Marx and Mavrim's own son, Prince Gaval, who had survived the battles. Darren hoped Gaval had led the rest of his followers west, where he would eventually fight the barbarians who had taken over the human capital and the city of Jatton. Darren's sister, Yun, had been in Jatton when Raigan fled her home there. He feared for Yun, but there was nothing he could do to help her until he was done here. It made Darren fidget in his seat as he thought of depending on one of his enemies, Gaval, to help his sister. The prince was unlikely to make a stop in Jatton, however, even if barbarians had taken control of the city. There just wasn't enough wealth there compared to the capital, which was under attack, last Darren heard, through a messenger from the west. That was weeks ago. The city could be lost by now. When they finished destroying the rift here, would Darren not only have to fight the barbarians, but take on Gaval's army as well? There was no telling what the prince hoped to accomplish after he took back the capital from the barbarians. He might leave Jatton to fend for itself until Darren and the rest of the rebels came to help. But there were so few of them, 3,000, just like the Analites. Just a month ago there had been 7,000 human troops in their army, so they had lost 4,000. But they have fared better than the army of 8,000 Analites. However, there were reasons for this discrepancy that Dasvis would not soon forget. Darren had put the safety of his men above the safety of the Analites, but it was only because he had to. Dasvis hadn't listened when Darren had told him not to surround the palace after Jarl had taken control. All Darren had been able to do was order his men to a safer location amidst the circle of troops. At least Dasvis listened now. He and Darren, as well as the other leaders, had spent many hours coming up with the best way to take on the rift tomorrow, and the gigantic beast that guarded it. It was difficult for Andar to sleep that night, for he knew what he had to do in the morning. He thought it would comfort him to think of Siki, of the beautiful sound of her laugh and the comforting touch of her fingers on his arm. But the more he thought of her, the more he desired her. Although this distracted him from his task tomorrow, it did not help sleep come. Andar grinded his teeth, jealous at the thought that some man would get to marry Siki just because he was born into a wealthy family. Anger consumed him when he remembered Siki's reluctance to be married to that man in the brief conversation that they'd had about it. She did not want this loveless union, and yet she would do it for her people. Andar relaxed somewhat after he found himself hoping that she would at least find some way to be happy. Eventually, he would be leaving this place, and leaving Siki as well. There was no life for him here. He and the other human soldiers had come here to destroy the rift, and they would either succeed or fail tomorrow. If they succeeded, they would leave. If they failed, they'd be dead. And he supposed that meant there would be nothing else to worry about. Not that it really helped. Andar did not dream that night. He didn't sleep deeply enough to do so. He woke before sunrise and left his quarters for possibly the last bath he would ever take in this Analite palace. Leo had spent the night with Raigan again, and Andar was glad for this. He'd wanted solitude last night, especially after Siki's merry company was taken away by her father, but this morning Andar longed to spend more time with his brother. He was glad later when he found Leo eating alone in the common room near their bed quarters. "No, Reigen?" Andar asked. "I wanted to share this meal just with you." Andar smiled. Leo was 14, 3 years younger than Andar, but he didn't look it. Andar was only slightly taller and stronger now. He wondered if Leo might one day surpass his height. It was strange for a stalwart link to form between them because they were quite different from each other, at least to Andar. Beyond the similar shape of their bodies, they had many physical differences. Andar's hair was longer and parted down the centre, while Leo's was very short. Andar knew himself to be handsome, but his chiselled features did not exude innocence the way Leo's eyes and softer features did. Leo had a good heart, always had. He would never secretly wish for the demise of Siki's husband-to-be, for example. Stalwart links were only created naturally, for they were far too strong for any man to make. They were a powerful bond occurring in portals, like the one Andar had worked near in Jatton. A stalwart link was the only reason it still might be open, the link creating a bond between artistry in the light realm and esotery in the dark realm. It was still a mystery as to how such a powerful bond had formed between Andar and his brother, but they were thankful for it. It afforded them the ability to communicate with one another, not with words, but with emotions and thoughts, so long as they were strong. Andar could feel that his brother was scared, but not for himself. He feared for Andar. "Don't worry about me," Andar said. "You're the one who has to face the Kassiger." "But I'll have the whole army with me. You won't have anyone." "I don't need anyone. My task is simple." Andar didn't know why he was pretending to be so confident. Leo, with a simple nudge of his mind, could tell through their stalwart link that Andar was terrified. But Andar's brother politely kept from reaching out. Andar wasn't as polite. He could feel that Leo wanted to know Andar's true emotions. He was frightened that something might happen to his older brother. Andar would be strong, not just for himself, but for Leo as well. "Leo, I'm going to be fine, I promise you. I will make it back safely." Sky, fire, and ash, I shouldn't have said that. Andar had forgotten the letter he'd written for Siki last night before getting in bed. How's he supposed to bring it up now without looking like a fool? He couldn't. "But just in case something does happen, can you give this to Siki?" "Don't you want to speak with her yourself?" Leo asked, not taking the letter. "I will take back the letter and tell her the words myself if I return." He tried to hand it to Leo again. "This is just in case I don't." Leo sighed as he took it. Andar knew he wouldn't have to worry about Leo reading it. He wouldn't be dying to find out what was inside, like Andar would. They ate in silence for a while, and eventually Andar couldn't put anything else in his uneasy stomach. He faced his brother. "I'm proud of you. I always have been." Leo smiled. "I'm proud of you, too." The rift of esotery was so massive that it did not only surpass the height of the mountains around the Analite capital, it took up much of the sky as well. It was like looking at a vast ocean where there should be the blue of the sky and the white of the clouds. Andar marched at the head of the army next to his father and brother. All the Analite citizens stood on the outskirts of the main road through the capital. Many nodded to show their gratitude. Some smiled, but most looked at the dwindling army with obvious worry. So many allies had fallen already. So many people had lost friends and family. The powerful Karen Trange had not recovered, but died from esotery poisoning. Now Andar would have to go into the rift. If it poisoned him as well, there would be no hope for him. But there was no one better for this task. He had proven he could enter a rift and destroy the source of esotery in the light realm. He had done so in the barbarian territory of Disatel, but the rift there was tiny compared to this one. In theory, there was only one reason this rift continued to grow. Many years ago, a wisdom tree grew so large that its roots reached the source of artistry deep down in the earth. For reasons even Karen couldn't explain, this changed the wisdom tree at its core. The artistry went through the tree and came out as esotery. The levels of esotery it produced were not dangerous on their own, but as this esotery looked for more of the blue energy to bond to, it could only locate that which was in the dark realm. So esotery in the light realm began to bond with esotery in the dark realm. In this process of the energies pulling at each other, a rift had to be formed for them to reach one another, an opening between the realms. This was the birth of the rift. Over the last 20-something years, it grew to support an increasing amount of esotery bonding between the realms. It was now estimated to be more than 100 miles in diameter. This estimation was very important to Andar because it was up to him to walk to the centre of this rift and find the wisdom tree that continued to produce esotery. If the rift was 100 miles long, he would have to walk 50 miles to reach its centre. In his pack were a few things to help him on this trek. There had been much debate with Leo and their father as to what would be worth the wait. They all agreed that matches and flint were essential, but the importance of certain things like a lamp and light armour were much more difficult to assess. In theory, Andar shouldn't encounter any living thing within the rift, so light armour should be unnecessary, but a sword, although unnecessary for the very same reason, felt wrong to leave behind. He needed something to damage the roots of the wisdom tree anyway, so it might as well be a sword. The lamp was awkward to carry for such a long distance, but the wisdom tree was theorized to be somewhere within the mountains far to the north. It might be in a place too dark for Andar to see without light, and he hadn't figured out how to make a T-link, a transfer link, in which he would be able to control a cluster of light. Leo had told him that Karen had done this, but neither of them had figured out how. Andar continued to march through the capital as he thought through the choices he'd made. He found comfort in the waves and nods of the Analite citizens. He wished he could take his horse into the rift, but it would not be practical to do so. The only way Andar was able to enter the rift without being transported through to the dark realm was by maintaining a link to his brother as Leo stayed in the light realm. This link of artistry would be strong enough to hold Andar in their realm. He had tested this with Siki, using a link of the attraction between them to enter the rift in Disatel. There had been moments within the rift when his nerves had threatened to overtake this attraction, but in the end he had made it to the wisdom tree at the centre and damaged its roots enough for the rift to collapse. Maintaining a bond to Leo would be easy. The stalwart link itself was all Andar needed to focus on. It would not break no matter what Andar might encounter. But he could not link his horse to anything in the light realm that would keep the animal grounded, so he would have to make this trek without one. There had been talk of sending a few other mages with Andar, powerful men or women like Lane Writhe, who were confident they could hold a link to someone or something that would keep them grounded. But even Lane admitted that she probably wouldn't be able to maintain a link at the distance they needed to travel. "There's nothing in there that's going to hurt me," Andar repeated to himself. He didn't need another mage. He just had to keep some of his focus on his link to his brother, and he would eventually make it. Besides, every other mage would be needed to distract the Cassiger. The great beast that guarded the rift was mountainous. Their army was nearly 5 times smaller than the first time they had fought the Cassiger, and they had been forced to flee. Many hadn't been told beforehand that such a beast even existed. The kings were blamed. Tension grew. But Andar figured that, as everyone had come together to fight Jarl Marks, the tension was gone now. He did feel it last night, however, when an Analite servant dragged Siki away from Andar. He was in a poor mental state when they marched out of the capital. Andar was taking on the most daunting task of his life, to destroy something that would not reach any human cities in Andar's lifetime. He expected more gratitude from the Analite king. But Dasvis was still bitter that some of the greedy men who'd come here, Jarl Marks chief among them, had turned on the king and his allies. That wasn't Andar's fault. If it wasn't for Andar, Leo, and Raigan, in fact, Jarl Marks would have stolen all the gold from the palace and escaped. There would not have been enough money to pay the Analite troops to fight, and there would not have been enough humans left here to take on the beast on their own. Andar's resentment was gone in an instant, as he saw the look in his brother's eyes and realized it was time for them to separate. "If you need something," Leo said, "you will tell me, right?" "I will," Andar replied, "so long as there's something you can do about it." "I suppose that's fair." They embraced while the rest of their army continued northeast toward the rift. As they parted, Andar noticed many people wishing him luck, humans and Analytes alike. "Be safe, Andar," many of the humans added. "Strength, Andar," said some of the Analytes passing by. It was probably a phrase in Analyse that they'd had translated. There were only about 10 translators who knew both languages, so Andar appreciated their effort. Leo did not turn to go with them, yet standing still as he stared at Andar as if this might be the last time they saw each other. Darren had slowed earlier to discuss the last bit of strategy with his troops, and he approached Andar and Leo now. He came out of the marching army and opened his arms to Andar. It made Andar feel young and protected as he hugged his father. He would give anything for this mission to be over. "You sure you have everything you need?" his father asked as they parted. "I'm sure." "And you know how long to wait?" "An hour, father. I know." The rest of the army needed time to distract the beast properly, so Andar could slip into the rift. There was still the fear that the Cassiger would sense him entering, but even if that was the case, it would pull the beast away from the rift while thousands tried to disrupt it. Even an unintelligent creature would likely stay to face the army, then chase after one man. The beast should still be injured as well. The Cassiger had run out of the rift a few days earlier, charging through the capital on its way to the palace and leaving a trail of cracked earth in its wake. Andar's father and brother, along with many troops of the human army, had stood against it as it tried to crush Leo. It was Leo who did the most damage to it, linking everything together with the use of a testing stone. He had then organized their troops to all move in the same direction, sliding a thick spear lodged in the Cassiger's foot, through the beast's muscle and bone. Andar had seen much of the beast's dried blood, staining the cracked earth on his way to the rift, but now he would veer off from that path and head straight north. "Be as safe as you can," Darren told him. "Nothing risky." "Don't worry," Andar assured. "I will get it done safely." After another long look, Leo and Darren both turned to follow the rest of the army northeast. They would follow the Cassiger's blood for 2 days, until they reached the face of the rift. Andar would take a slower route to reach a different section of the rift, but first he would have to wait to ensure his army had plenty of time to prepare their distraction. Soon he was all alone. The capital was only an hour walk behind. He turned and stared at the citizens who were gathered at the edge, where their enormous buildings came to a sudden end, and their paved path led to a dirt trail. There were hundreds watching. He imagined Dasvis and Siki were among them. Andar wanted to take out his spyglass. He needed to see Siki one last time. He had expected her to be among the citizens gathered in the streets to wish the soldiers well, but he hadn't seen her. Perhaps she knew the same thing as Andar. It was best if they tried to forget each other, but he wasn't sure he could do that. At least he'd given his letter to Leo. Siki would get it, should anything happen to him. During all the time Andar had spent with Siki during these last few weeks, which was the majority of most days, he had promised himself he would not make advances toward her. He would not attempt to touch her hand. He would not try to put his arm around her. He certainly would not try to kiss her. Neither would he invite her to his room at any point, nor ask her to walk with him. He'd promised himself he would not make any attempt to start any kind of romance between them, and yet he often found himself in these exact situations. He'd lost track of the number of times she'd touched his arm, or that he'd touched her hand. They had taken many walks together, and they had spent quite a lot of time in his room, talking and laughing. She had become a good friend, but it was obvious to Andar, as it should be obvious to her, that there was much more to their interactions than friendship. This was why she had not come to say goodbye. There would be no problem if she was only a friend. Andar would not let this break his spirit, though it was a heavy burden on his heart. Eventually he started north. It would take 2 days for him to reach the rift where he would be entering it, but it looked so close it seemed as if he could reach it after a long run. White lines tore through the surface, bright light shooting out akin to strikes of lightning going every which way through the air. Andar had secretly hoped that the rift would collapse on its own, for it certainly looked unstable. But these tears had only become less frequent in the days that had passed since Andar had destroyed the smaller rift linked to this one. It was repairing itself. Or the beast was repairing it. Or even worse, the man who Karen saw in the dark realm was somehow the one responsible for keeping up its strength. The man was responsible for the death of Karen, telling the Cassiger to attack the Master Mage while he was in the dark realm. Karen had fled into a cavern to escape the giant beast, but much of the cavern had collapsed on top of him, injuring him while breaking his protective cocoon. Esoteric poison had finished him off later, and Andar refused to admit to anyone just how scared he was of falling to the same fate. Whoever this man was, he was connected to the Cassiger, and the Cassiger was connected to the rift. This man wouldn't want Andar going inside the rift to collapse it. Everyone knew this as a fact. What no one could figure out was what this man might be able to do from the dark realm to stop Andar. Chapter 2. Leo's fear was almost crippling. It was a struggle to force his legs to keep up with his father as they neared the rift, but Leo had prepared himself for this over the last day and a half. He was as ready as he would ever be to face the enormous beast. The rift buzzed and crackled. Winds roared. Leo could feel the growing panic of everyone in the army as they stopped a half-mile short and prepared for the fight. Everyone took directions from Darren and Lane as a group of soldiers dug out a wide circle in the grass. One large section of the field needed to be separated from the rest, so the fire they would start did not spread out of control. With the help of another group of troops, a massive pile of sticks, leaves, and saplings soon lay ready to burn. There had been much debate between Leo, Darren, and Reigen as to whether Reigen should come with them. She was strong with Esoteric and argued that she might make the difference as to whether Erisina and the other summoners managed to collapse the rift by pulling at the firm Esoteric until it was no longer bonded with itself. But if Andar made it to the centre and damaged the roots of the wisdom tree, then the rift would collapse without the help of any summoner. Eventually Reigen agreed to stay behind in the capital. She and Leo hadn't spent more than a few hours apart from each other since they'd reunited. He missed her company. She always had a way of putting him at ease. No matter what they encountered, they would get through it together. But he was glad she was back where she was safe. The Analite king had stayed behind with his family, but Mavrim Aurello was here among the human troops. He was not quite at the front, but Leo still felt proud to know that Mavrim was risking his life to be here. He was probably the most powerful mage left, now that Karen had perished. There were enough mages with real strength, Leo included, that he figured they might be able to keep the beast in place, at least for a moment. Hopefully that was all it would take to slay it. They didn't need to slay the beast, just distract it enough so it wouldn't go after Andar, but slaying the Cassiger would be a sweet victory nonetheless. Leo found Erisina standing among the human troops. She was the only Analite in their section, and she stared at the rift with her hands on her hips, as if trying to figure out a puzzle. The other 3,000 Analites were forming ranks on the eastern side of their army. Soon Leo took his place near the middle, beside his father. The two armies had many of the same weapons as the last time they drove back the beast successfully, mainly the oversized spears that could only impale the beast if it was to step on them or swipe at them. Last time the Cassiger was aware enough that it avoided those weapons whenever possible. Considering these spears had allowed Leo to cause extreme damage to the Cassiger's foot, he figured the beast would be even more scared of them now. The thought of the creature being frightened gave Leo the strength he needed to be brave. "March!" Darren ordered. The line of troops started toward the rift. The heavy thud of their boots gave Leo a sense of pride, but fear overtook him when the beast appeared. It started by sticking one leg through the surface of the rift as the Esoteric crackled around it. Waves of white light shone across the surface as a second leg stomped down. Each foot had claws on the end that were as long as Leo was tall. The leg itself was so large that only trees and mountains could surpass its height. The beast moved out of the rift slowly, showing caution Leo hadn't seen from it before. Leo looked at the ground beneath its previously injured front foot, hoping to see blood, but he couldn't make out anything red within the cracking earth. The flesh of the beast was not of this world. It did not look like skin or scales. It was made of something else, dark in colour and blurring as the beast moved toward them. It was almost as if the Cassiger existed between the planes. The body was larger than any of the massive Analite buildings, which were known for housing up to 1,000 troops. The beast was longer than it was tall, with spikes of bone down its spine. The face of the beast was the strangest of all, with white, burning eyes that seemed to hold great anger. It looked at them as trespassers. The Cassiger had no mouth, but black, misshapen lines, where a mouth should be, as if something had gone wrong during its development. The beast reared up on its two hind legs and then slammed its front feet down. A crack shot through the earth, stopping.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?